I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky, when I noticed something that would unravel 15 years of my life in the span of a single morning. The HOA maintenance crew had set up orange cones along what they claimed was the western boundary of the development, and those cones were sitting smack in the middle of where my cattle normally grazed. My name is Bradley Quinn, and I had owned this ranch outside of Billings, Montana for nearly 2 decades. When the Meadowbrook Hills development went up on the adjacent land back in 2010, I had made my peace with having neighbors. The HOA had promised to respect the existing property lines, and for 15 years, I had no reason to doubt them. But standing there with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching those workers hammer stakes into my grazing land, something felt fundamentally wrong. I pulled on my boots and headed outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying that particular smell of sagebrush and distant rain that I had loved since childhood. My border collie, Rex, trotted beside me as I made my way toward the workers. They had already installed what looked like decorative fencing along the line they had marked. "Morning," I called out to the nearest worker, a younger guy with a Meadowbrook Hills polo shirt. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" He barely looked up from his post hole digger. "Just following orders. HOA wants a clear demarcation between the development and the ranch land." "This is my ranch land," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're about 40 feet onto my property." That got his attention. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning. "No, sir, this is the property line. We have it marked on our development plans." I felt my jaw tighten. "Then your plans are wrong. I'd like to speak with whoever authorized this." He pulled out his phone and made a call. 5 minutes later, a silver Lexus pulled up, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a country club catalog. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she wore sunglasses despite the fact that the sun had barely cleared the horizon. "I'm Patricia Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA board," she announced, extending her hand but not actually waiting for me to shake it. "I understand there's some confusion about our property improvement project." "No confusion on my end," I replied. "You're building on my land." Patricia removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes that sized me up like I was something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "Mr. Quinn, I understand you've been here a long time, but the development has clear boundaries established when we purchased this land in 2009. This fence marks the eastern edge of our property." "Then your boundaries are wrong," I said. "I've got the original survey from when I purchased this ranch in 2006. My western fence line extends another 40 feet past where you're building." She gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Surveys can be outdated. We had our own survey done when we broke ground, and it clearly shows this is our land. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have work to complete." "I'm not excusing anything," I said, feeling heat rise in my chest. "Stop work immediately until we can sort this out properly." Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Quinn, I don't take orders from you. This work is proceeding as planned. If you have a problem with it, I suggest you consult with an attorney." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Lexus. I stood there watching them continue to work, feeling anger and disbelief warring in my gut. Rex whined beside me, sensing my distress. I pulled out my phone and called my ranch hand, Miguel, telling him to move the cattle to the eastern pasture until this got sorted out. Then I called the only attorney I knew personally, Tom Richardson, who handled my ranch's business matters. Tom listened to my story and let out a low whistle. "Brad, this is serious. If they've been encroaching for 15 years, there are adverse possession laws that could come into play." Adverse possession. What's that? Basically, If someone openly uses property that isn't theirs for a certain period of time, they can sometimes claim legal ownership. In Montana, that period is 5 years, but there are conditions. They need to show the use was hostile, actual, open and notorious, exclusive and continuous. My blood ran cold. So you're saying they might own my land now? Not necessarily. First, we need to establish the actual property line. I'm going to recommend we hire an independent surveyor, someone with no connection to either party. Then we'll know what we're dealing with. Do it, I said without hesitation. I want this resolved. Tom told me he knew a reputable surveying company out of Billings, Frontier Land Surveys, and he would get them out to the ranch as soon as possible. In the meantime, he advised me to document everything, take photos, and keep records of any communication with the HOA. I spent the rest of that day doing exactly that. I photographed the new fencing, the orange cones, the workers, everything. I dug out my original property survey from 2006, along with the deed and all the documentation from when I purchased the ranch. The western boundary was clearly marked, and it extended exactly 40 feet beyond where the HOA was now building. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the mountains, trying to make sense of it all. How had this happened? For 15 years, I had seen the HOA maintain that strip of land. They had planted trees there, installed walking paths, even built a small gazebo. I had assumed it was just on their side of the property line, maybe a nice buffer between us. It had never occurred to me to check. The next morning, I got a certified letter from the HOA's legal team. It was a cease and desist, ordering me to stop harassing their workers and interfering with their property improvements. Reading it made my hands shake. They were acting like I was the one in the wrong. Tom called me that afternoon. Good news. Frontier can get someone out there tomorrow morning. Bad news, they need access to both sides of the disputed boundary, which means we'll need to notify the HOA. Let them know, I said. I want this official. The surveyor arrived at 8 the next morning in a truck loaded with equipment. His name was Dennis Wright, a weathered man in his 60s who had been surveying Montana land for 40 years. He had that calm competence that came from decades of experience. "Mr. Quinn," he said, shaking my hand firmly. Tom filled me in on the situation. "I'm going to need to locate your original survey markers and compare them with the current boundaries. This might take a few days." "Whatever it takes," I told him. Dennis and his assistant, a younger woman named Sarah, set up their equipment and got to work. I watched them use GPS technology, old-fashioned surveying tools, and what looked like metal detectors to locate the original property markers. Patricia showed up around 10, stepping out of her Lexus with a man in an expensive suit. "This is Gerald Hampton, our HOA attorney," she announced. "We're here to observe this survey." Dennis barely glanced up from his theodolite. "Fine by me, just stay out of the way." Patricia's face flushed red, but Gerald put a hand on her arm. They stood off to the side, watching in silence. I could see Patricia making calls on her phone, her expression growing more agitated as the morning wore on. By mid-afternoon, Dennis had located 3 of the original survey markers. They were exactly where my 2006 survey said they should be, and they were exactly 40 feet west of where the HOA claimed the property line ran. "Mr. Quinn," Dennis called me over. "Take a look at this." He showed me on his tablet where the original markers were plotted against the current GPS coordinates. The line was unmistakable. The HOA had been encroaching on my property for 15 years. "There's no doubt?" I asked. "None whatsoever. These markers are original. They match the survey data from 2006, and they clearly establish your western boundary 40 feet past where the HOA has been maintaining." Patricia marched over, her heels sinking into the soft earth. "Let me see that." Dennis turned the tablet toward her. I watched the color drain from her face as she processed what she was seeing. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Our survey from 2009 shows different boundaries." "Then your surveyor made an error," Dennis said flatly. "These markers don't lie." Gerald was already on his phone, walking away to speak privately. Patricia stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. "I want that fence removed from my property," I said quietly. "And I want compensation for 15 years of lost use of my land." Patricia's shock transformed instantly into fury. "You have no right to compensation. We've been maintaining that land in good faith. We improved it. We planted mature trees that cost thousands of dollars each. We built amenities that enhance property values for everyone. On my land," I repeated. "Without my permission." She jabbed a finger at me. "You're going to regret this. The HOA will fight you every step of the way." "That's enough, Patricia," Gerald said, returning from his call. He looked tired. "Mr. Quinn, we'll need to review this survey and consult with our own experts. In the meantime, I'm advising the HOA to halt all work on the disputed boundary." "Smart move," Tom said, appearing at my elbow. I had not even heard him drive up. "And Gerald, you should know we'll be filing a formal complaint and seeking damages for the encroachment." Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated in ways I could never have imagined. The HOA hired their own surveyor, who confirmed Dennis's findings. The property line was exactly where I said it was. But instead of backing down, Patricia doubled down. I started getting violations from the HOA. My ranch was not part of their development, but suddenly, I was receiving citations for unsightly structures referring to my barn, improper fencing regarding my cattle fences, and noise violations because apparently my rooster was disturbing the peace. Each citation came with a threat of fines. "They can't do this," I told Tom over the phone. "I'm not even a member of their HOA." "They're harassing you," Tom agreed. "Keep every single violation notice. This is going to help our case." But Patricia was not done. She started a campaign within the development, telling homeowners that I was trying to steal HOA property and destroy their amenities. She sent out newsletters filled with half-truths and outright lies. Soon, I was getting dirty looks whenever I drove past the development. Someone spray-painted "Land Thief" on my mailbox. I was sitting in Tom's office a week later, watching him review the growing file of harassment documentation, when he looked up at me seriously. "Brad, I think we need to consider that this goes beyond a simple property dispute. The HOA has engaged in what appears to be systematic harassment and possibly defamation. We could add that to our lawsuit." "How long will this take?" I asked. "I can't run my ranch properly with 40 feet of my grazing land fenced off. It could take months, maybe longer if they fight it." "But here's something to consider. Given that they've been openly using your property for 15 years, they might try to claim adverse possession. You mentioned that before. Can they really take my land?" Tom leaned back in his chair. "In Montana, they would need to prove 5 elements. Hostile use, meaning without your permission. Actual possession, meaning they physically used it. Open and notorious, meaning visible use. Exclusive, meaning they controlled it. And continuous for 5 years. They have some of those elements, but I didn't give them permission. The question is whether your lack of objection for 15 years constitutes implied permission, or at least undermines their claim of hostile use. It's complicated. However, they have a major problem. The HOA is not an individual. There's case law in Montana suggesting that an HOA may not be able to claim adverse possession the same way an individual can. This was giving me a headache. So what do? We file suit for ejectment, which forces them to remove their encroachments. We seek damages for trespass and loss of use, and we document every single act of harassment they commit because that shows bad faith. We filed the lawsuit the next day. Bradley Quinn v. Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. The moment the papers were served, things got worse. Patricia showed up at my ranch with a sheriff's deputy. She claimed I had threatened her. The deputy, a young guy named Officer Martinez, looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Quinn, did you have any contact with Miss Morrison in the last 24 hours? "No," I said honestly. "I haven't spoken to her since the surveyor came out 2 weeks ago." Patricia's face was red. "He called me and said I would pay for what I had done. He threatened me." "I did no such thing," I said, feeling anger surge. "Officer, I have phone records. I haven't called her." Officer Martinez looked between us. "Miss Morrison, do you have proof of this call? A recording or phone log?" she sputtered. "It came from an unknown number." "Then I can't verify it came from Mr. Quinn." "I'm going to suggest you both maintain distance from each other and let your attorneys handle things." After they left, I was shaking. She had just tried to get me arrested on false charges. I called Tom immediately. "She's escalating," Tom said grimly. "This is actually good for us in a legal sense. It shows a pattern of malicious behavior. But Brad, you need to be careful. Don't contact her directly. Don't go onto HOA property. Document everything." That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about 15 years. 15 years of watching them maintain that strip of land, plant trees, build that gazebo. How had I been so blind? The truth was, I had trusted them. When they said the property line was where it was, I had believed them. I had been focused on running my ranch, dealing with cattle prices, drought, all the normal challenges of ranch life. I had not thought to verify something that seemed so straightforward. The next incident came 3 days later. I was moving cattle from one pasture to another, a normal operation I had done 1,000 times. The route took me along the edge of the disputed property. Suddenly, Patricia appeared with her phone out, recording me. "You're trespassing on HOA property," she yelled. "I'm calling the police." "I'm on my own land," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The land the survey proved is mine. That survey is disputed. Until a court rules this is HOA property." She actually did call the police. Officer Martinez showed up again, and this time he looked annoyed. "Miss Morrison, the civil dispute over the property line doesn't give you the right to harass Mr. Quinn when he's conducting normal ranch operations." "Mr. Quinn, are you on the disputed strip right now?" "No, sir, I'm west of it, on land that's unquestionably mine." He turned to Patricia. "Then there's no issue here. Madam, please stop calling us for civil matters. If you continue, you could be charged with misuse of emergency services." I could see her face turning purple as the officer drove away. She pointed at me. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed. "It's not." The preliminary hearing for our lawsuit was set for 6 weeks out. In that time, the harassment continued. My ranch was vandalized 3 times. Someone cut my fence, letting cattle wander onto the highway. Someone slashed the tires on my truck. Someone even poisoned one of my water troughs, though thankfully I caught it before the cattle drank much. I installed security cameras everywhere. Tom advised me to hire a private investigator, a guy named Rick Stevens who specialized in civil cases. Rick was ex-military, methodical and thorough. "Mr. Quinn," he told me after reviewing everything, "this HOA president is obsessed. I've seen cases like this before. She's made this personal and she's going to keep escalating. Can you prove she's behind the vandalism? Give me time. Rick set up additional cameras with night vision and motion detection. It took less than a week to get results. A teenage kid from the development was caught on camera cutting my fence. Rick confronted him with the video, and the kid broke down immediately. "Miss Morrison paid me," he sobbed. "She said you were a bad person who was trying to hurt the neighborhood. She gave me $500 to mess with your ranch." Rick got it all on recording. The kid's parents were horrified and fully cooperative. We had our proof. Tom filed an emergency motion. "This is criminal conspiracy, Brad. We're past civil disputes now." The judge granted a temporary restraining order against Patricia, ordering her to stay at least 500 feet from me and my property. But more importantly, the prosecutor's office got involved. Paying someone to commit vandalism was a crime. I testified before a grand jury. I brought all the evidence, the videos, the recordings, the documentation of harassment. The kid testified too, clearly terrified but honest. 2 weeks later, Patricia Morrison was indicted on charges of criminal mischief, conspiracy to commit vandalism, and harassment. The HOA board finally woke up to what was happening. Patricia was suspended from her position pending the criminal trial. An emergency board meeting was called and 3 new members were elected. The new president, a reasonable guy named Mark Stevens, called me directly. "Mr. Quinn, I want to apologize for everything that's happened. The board was not fully aware of the situation. We've reviewed the surveys and it's clear the property line is where you say it is. We'd like to discuss a settlement." I met with Mark, his attorney Tom, and 2 other board members at a neutral location, a conference room at the local library. Mark looked embarrassed. "We want to remove all structures from your property immediately," he began. "We'll restore the land to its original condition, and we want to compensate you fairly for the lost use." Tom had done the math. 40 feet along the length of the disputed boundary was roughly 2 acres of prime grazing land. Over 15 years, the lost revenue from reduced cattle capacity, plus the value of improvements made by the HOA using my land, plus damages for harassment, came to a substantial number. "We're looking at $350,000, Tom said. Mark winced but nodded. "We have insurance that will cover most of that. The HOA's lawyers made a terrible mistake back in 2009 and we're prepared to make this right." "What about Patricia?" I asked. Mark sighed. "She's facing criminal charges. The HOA is cooperating fully with the prosecution. Between you and me, she had some personal financial issues and saw the HOA as her little kingdom to control. She took your challenge as a personal attack. We negotiated for 3 hours. In the end, we agreed on $325,000, immediate removal of all encroachments, restoration of the land, and a recorded easement clearly establishing the boundary. The HOA also agreed to pay my attorney's fees. The structures came down the next week. I watched as crews removed the gazebo, pulled up the walking paths, and carefully transplanted the mature trees back onto HOA property. It was surreal seeing that strip of land cleared after 15 years. Patricia's criminal trial was set for 3 months later. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Klein, called me to testify. I sat in the witness box and told the whole story. Patricia sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, her expensive clothes replaced with a modest dress, her severe hairstyle softened. The trial lasted 4 days. The kid testified again. Rick testified about the investigation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, an older man named Harold Cooper, did not mince words at sentencing. Miss Morrison, you took a civil dispute and turned it into a criminal campaign of harassment and vandalism. You paid a minor to commit crimes on your behalf. You abused your position of trust within your community. This court sentences you to 2 years in the Montana State Prison, with credit for time served, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay restitution to Mr. Quinn in the amount of $15,000 for the vandalism damages not covered by the settlement. I watched as they led her away in handcuffs. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. The HOA settlement check cleared a week later. I deposited it and immediately hired a contractor to repair all the damage to my ranch. New fences, new water troughs, repairs to buildings that had been vandalized. I also hired a surveyor to place permanent, clearly visible boundary markers every 100 feet along the western edge of my property. Miguel helped me move the cattle back to the restored grazing land. It felt good seeing them spread out across the full ranch again. Rex ran alongside them, doing his job, and for the first time in months, I felt like things were back to normal. Mark from the HOA stopped by a few weeks after everything was settled. He brought a bottle of whiskey and an apology. "I wanted you to know the board has implemented new policies," he said as we sat on my porch. "Every major decision now requires independent verification. We're reviewing all our property boundaries, and we've established an ethics committee to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." "That's good," I said, pouring us both a drink. "Patricia lost everything, you know," Mark continued. "Her husband divorced her. She had to sell their house to pay legal fees. I almost feel sorry for her." "She made her choices," I replied. "She could have admitted the mistake and worked with me to fix it. Instead, she declared war." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the mountains. The same view I had been watching for 20 years, but somehow it looked different now. Clearer, maybe, more defined. Tom called me a few days later with news. "The Montana Cattlemen's Association wants to interview you. Your case is apparently being used as a cautionary tale about verifying property boundaries and dealing with HOAs. They want to feature it in their newsletter." "I'm not looking for publicity," I said. "I know. But it might help other ranchers avoid what you went through." I agreed to the interview. A writer came out to the ranch, walked the property line with me, took photos of the boundary markers. The article ran the next month under the headline "Vigilance and Verification: One Rancher's 15-Year Property Dispute." I got letters from other ranchers after that. Several had similar stories of encroachment, though none as extensive as mine. A few were dealing with difficult HOAs on adjacent land. I responded to each one, sharing what I had learned. Check your boundaries regularly. Document everything. Don't assume good faith. Hire experts. Stand your ground. Life slowly returned to normal. The cattle market improved. We had good rainfall that spring. The grass came in thick and green, especially on the 2 acres that had been returned to grazing. It was like the land was celebrating its freedom. I ran into Jennifer Klein, the prosecutor, at a diner in Billings several months after the trial. She invited me to join her for coffee. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Your case was one of the most clear-cut I've handled. The evidence was meticulous." "That was mostly my attorney and the investigator," I said. She shook her head. "It was you. You stayed calm. You documented everything. You didn't retaliate even when you had every reason to be angry. That made all the difference." "I came close to retaliating," I admitted. "There were nights I wanted to tear down that gazebo myself. But you didn't. You trusted the system. That takes strength." The HOA continued operating under new management. They were good neighbors after that. Mark made sure to communicate about anything that might affect my ranch. When they planned a community event that might generate noise, he gave me advance notice. When they needed to access utility easements near the property line, they asked permission first. Patricia got out of prison after 18 months on good behavior. I heard she moved to Wyoming to live with relatives. I never saw her again. One afternoon, about a year after everything was settled, I was fixing a fence post when I saw a car pull up to the ranch. A young couple got out, looking nervous. "Mr. Quinn," the man called. "Sorry to bother you. We're looking at a house in Meadowbrook Hills, and we heard about the property dispute. We wanted to hear your side of the story before we made an offer." I invited them in, made coffee, and told them everything. They listened intently. "So the HOA is better now?" the woman asked. "Much better. New leadership, new policies. But my advice: before you buy any property near an HOA, verify every single boundary. Hire your own surveyor. Don't trust what anyone tells you. See it for yourself." They thanked me and left. I learned later they did buy the house, and they did hire a surveyor first. Everything checked out. Tom became a good friend after the case. He stopped by the ranch regularly, sometimes bringing his kids to see the cattle. His teenage son was fascinated by ranch life, and I let him help with feeding sometimes. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't noticed those orange cones that morning?" Tom asked me one day. I had thought about it plenty. "They would have finished the fence. I probably would have said something eventually, but it would have been even more entrenched. Harder to fight. Timing is everything." "So is paying attention," I replied. "I let 15 years go by without checking. That's on me." "You trusted your neighbors. That's not a character flaw." "No, but blind trust is." The financial settlement allowed me to make improvements to the ranch I had been putting off for years. I upgraded my irrigation system. I bought new equipment. I even hired a second ranch hand, a young guy fresh out of agricultural school who had good ideas about sustainable ranching practices. Miguel appreciated having help. He had been running himself ragged trying to keep up with everything while I dealt with the lawsuit. "Boss," he said one day, "I'm glad we got your land back, but I'm even more glad you didn't let them make you crazy. I've seen men lose themselves in fights like that." He was right. I could have become consumed by anger and revenge. I could have let Patricia's harassment turn me bitter. But every time I felt that darkness creeping in, I would walk out on my porch, look at the mountains, and remember why I loved this land. It was not about winning or losing. It was about home. The dispute changed how I approached everything. I started attending county planning meetings when development projects were proposed near ranch land. I joined a local property rights advocacy group. I spoke at a Montana Farm Bureau meeting about the importance of knowing your boundaries. Other ranchers told me similar stories. One guy lost 30 acres to a golf course development because he had not checked his boundaries in 20 years. A woman nearly lost her water rights because an HOA claimed an old irrigation ditch. These stories were everywhere once I started listening. Rick, the private investigator, became a resource for several of these cases. He told me he had started specializing in property disputes after seeing how important they were to rural communities. "You were lucky," he said. "You had good evidence, a clear survey, and their president was sloppy enough to get caught. A lot of these cases are much messier." I knew he was right. If Patricia had been smarter, if she had not escalated to criminal behavior, the case might have dragged on for years. I might have been forced into an expensive adverse possession defense. I might have lost. The boundary markers I had installed became a point of pride. They were substantial metal posts with engraved plates showing the property coordinates. Every few months, I would walk the entire western boundary, checking each marker, making sure everything was clear and visible. One day during that walk, I found Mark from the HOA doing the same thing on his side. Making sure, I called out. He grinned sheepishly. Once burned, twice careful. We're checking all our boundaries quarterly now. Good policy. We walked together for a while, chatting about nothing important. It felt normal, neighborly, like how it should have been from the beginning. I learned later that the HOA's insurance company had sued their original surveyor for professional negligence. That case settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The surveyor lost his license. The law firm that had advised the HOA in 2009 also faced consequences. Several clients left them after learning about the case. Bad surveys and worse legal advice had cost the HOA hundreds of thousands of dollars and destroyed Patricia's life. Someone had to be accountable. Dennis Wright, the surveyor who had uncovered the truth, became the go-to expert for property line disputes in the region. He told me business had tripled after my case. You'd be surprised how many boundaries are wrong, he said. Not always deliberately. Sometimes it's just sloppy work or someone eyeballing it instead of doing a proper survey. But over time, those small errors compound. 40 feet isn't a small error, I pointed out. No, that was negligence. Pure and simple. Someone didn't do their job. 2 years after the settlement, I was invited to speak at a Montana Bar Association continuing legal education seminar about property disputes. Tom had suggested me as a lay witness perspective. I stood in front of a room full of attorneys and told my story. The questions afterward were intense. Lawyers wanted to know about documentation, evidence preservation, emotional management. One attorney asked how I had resisted the urge to take matters into my own hands. I came close, I admitted, but I had good advisors who kept me focused on the legal process, and I had something to lose. My ranch, my reputation, my freedom. Patricia had nothing to lose or thought she didn't. That made her dangerous. After the seminar, several attorneys approached me. They had clients with similar issues and wanted advice. I found myself becoming an informal consultant on property disputes, something I never would have imagined. The vandalism charges against Patricia had an unexpected consequence. The teenager she had paid, a kid named Jason, ended up turning his life around. His parents put him in counseling, and he wrote me a long letter apologizing. I wrote back, telling him I hoped he learned from his mistakes. Years later, I heard he had graduated college and become a social worker. Sometimes good things came from bad situations. My ranch prospered. The cattle operation expanded slightly. The sustainable practices we implemented improved the land. I even started hosting educational tours for school groups, showing them how modern ranching worked. Kids loved seeing the cattle and learning about property rights, boundaries, and good stewardship. One kid, maybe 10 years old, asked me during a tour, "Weren't you scared when the HOA lady was being mean to you?" I thought about that. Yes, I was. Not physically scared, but scared I might lose my ranch. This land has been in operation for over 100 years. I'm just the current caretaker. I was scared I might be the one who lost it. But you didn't lose it, the kid said. No, I didn't. Because I stood up for what was right and I had good people helping me. Simple lessons, but important ones. Tom eventually ran for county commissioner and won. One of his first initiatives was improving the county's property records system, making it easier for landowners to verify their boundaries. He credited my case with showing him how important good records were. The Montana Cattlemen's Association gave me an award for property rights advocacy. It was a nice plaque that I hung in my barn. Miguel joked that I was famous now. Not famous, I corrected. Just stubborn. Same thing in Montana, he laughed. 3 years after the settlement, Meadowbrook Hills held a community barbecue and invited me. I almost did not go, but Tom convinced me it would be good community relations. I showed up with a side of beef from my ranch as a donation. The reception was warm. Many residents came up to apologize for how they had treated me during the dispute. They had only heard Patricia's side of the story and believed her lies. Now they knew the truth and felt terrible. "I'm not angry," I told them. "She was convincing. She manipulated all of us." Mark gave a short speech during the barbecue, talking about how the community had learned from its mistakes. He mentioned my case specifically, praising how I had handled the situation with dignity and persistence. Bradley Quinn taught us that being good neighbors means respecting boundaries, telling the truth, and making things right when we're wrong, Mark said. "We're better neighbors because of him." People applauded. I felt embarrassed but also proud. This was what community should be. As I drove home that evening, full of good food and better conversation, I thought about how far things had come. From that angry confrontation with orange cones in my pasture to a community barbecue where I was welcomed and respected. It had been a long, difficult journey, but the land was mine. All of it, every inch verified and documented and protected. I could pass it on to the next generation knowing the boundaries were clear and the title was clean. That night, I stood on my porch as I had so many times before, looking at the stars above the Montana landscape. Rex sat beside me, gray around the muzzle now but still faithful. Somewhere in the darkness, my cattle grazed on land that had been restored to its rightful use. I thought about Patricia, wherever she was now. I hoped she had found some peace. Anger and control had consumed her, turned her into someone who could hire a teenager to commit crimes. That was a prison worse than any the state could impose. I thought about all the people who had helped me. Tom with his legal expertise and steady advice. Rick with his investigative skills. Dennis with his surveying precision. Miguel with his loyal support. Even Officer Martinez, who had treated both sides fairly when he could have been swayed by Patricia's position. Justice had prevailed, but it had not been easy or quick. It had required persistence, documentation, patience, and faith in the system. Most importantly, it had required me to stay true to who I was even when I was under attack. The ranch continued its rhythms. Seasons changed. Cattle were born, raised, and sold. The grass grew and was grazed. The water flowed through ditches my grandfather had helped dig. The fences stood strong, marking boundaries that were now absolutely certain. I hired a local artist to create a metal sculpture that I placed right at the westernmost boundary marker. It was a simple piece showing a rancher looking out over his land. Underneath was a plaque that read, "Know your ground, defend it with truth." People from Meadowbrook Hills would walk by sometimes and stop to read it. Some took photos. It became a minor landmark, a reminder of the dispute and its resolution. A journalist from the Billings Gazette did a follow-up story 5 years after the original incident. She walked the property line with me, interviewed Mark and Tom, and even got a statement from Patricia's attorney about her current situation. Patricia was working as a bookkeeper in Cheyenne, trying to rebuild her life. She declined to be interviewed. The article concluded, "In an era of increasing conflict between agricultural and residential land use, the Quinn case stands as both a warning and a model. A warning about the importance of accurate property records and ethical leadership, and a model for how disputes can be resolved through proper legal channels rather than escalation and revenge." I kept a copy of that article framed on my office wall, not because I was proud of the conflict, but because I was proud of how it ended. Truth had won over deception. Law had prevailed over harassment. Community had been restored after division. Young ranchers would come to visit sometimes, wanting to hear the story firsthand and get advice about dealing with encroaching development. My counsel was always the same: know your boundaries, document everything, stay calm, and trust the process. But also be prepared to fight for what's yours, because not everyone will respect your rights. The 40 feet of returned land became my most productive pasture. Maybe it was psychological, but I swear the grass grew greener there. I rotated cattle through it carefully, treating it as the valuable resource it was. 2 acres might not sound like much, but on a working ranch, every acre mattered. I never forgot the lesson of those 15 years of encroachment. Regular verification became part of my ranch management routine. Every spring, I would walk my entire property line, hundreds of acres worth, checking every marker and fence line. It took days, but it was worth it. I would never again let someone else define my boundaries. Tom and I would sometimes sit on my porch and talk about the case, analyzing what had gone right and what could have gone wrong. "You know what made the difference?" Tom said one evening. "You stayed rational. A lot of people would have gotten emotional, would have done something stupid. Patricia counted on you retaliating so she could paint you as the aggressor." I came close, I admitted again. There were nights I lay awake fantasizing about bulldozing that gazebo. "But you didn't. That's character." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. This land had tested me, but it had also sustained me. It had been worth fighting for. The HOA continued to thrive under better management. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills actually increased after the dispute was resolved. Potential buyers saw the new policies and ethical leadership as positive signs. Transparency and accountability attracted good neighbors. Mark served 2 terms as HOA president before stepping down to spend more time with his family. His successor, a retired engineer named Linda Martinez, maintained the same high standards. The HOA became a model for other developments in the region. I was invited to speak at a national property rights conference in Denver. Standing in front of hundreds of people from across the country, I told my story again. The response was overwhelming. So many people had similar experiences or knew someone who did. Property rights disputes were more common than I had ever realized. After my presentation, a law professor from the University of Montana approached me. She wanted to write a case study about my situation for her property law textbook. I agreed, on the condition that it focused on the lessons learned rather than the sensational aspects. The case study was published 2 years later. Law students across the country learned about Bradley Quinn v. Meadowbrook Hills HOA as an example of successful property rights defense and the dangers of HOA overreach. My attorney Tom joked that I was more famous in law schools than I was in Montana. Fame was never the point, though. Protection was. Protection of my land, my livelihood, my rights. And through protecting my own property, I had helped establish precedents and practices that protected others. The land that had been encroached upon became something of a sacred space for me. I would go there when I needed to think, or when I needed to remember why boundaries mattered. It was physical proof that standing up for yourself, even against overwhelming opposition, could succeed. Miguel retired after 30 years of working on the ranch. His replacement, a capable young woman named Sarah Thompson, had grown up on a ranch in eastern Montana and brought fresh perspectives. She immediately understood the significance of the boundary dispute and was meticulous about respecting property lines. "My dad lost 20 acres to a developer," she told me. "He didn't fight it because he couldn't afford the legal fees. It broke his heart. Hearing how you fought and won gives me hope. Tell your dad to contact Tom Richardson, I said. There might still be options, depending on how long ago it happened. She did, and while Sarah's father could not recover his lost acreage due to statutes of limitation, he was able to get compensation from the developer's insurance. It was not everything, but it was something. Another small victory. As I approached my 70th birthday, I started thinking about succession planning. I had no children of my own, but I had nieces and nephews who loved the ranch. One nephew, Benjamin Quinn Jr., had shown particular interest. He was studying agricultural business at Montana State and spent summers working on the ranch. "Uncle Brad," he said one day, "tell me about the boundary dispute. I've heard bits and pieces, but I want to know the whole story." We sat down and I told him everything. Not just the facts, but the emotions. The fear, the anger, the frustration, the ultimate satisfaction of justice. He listened with the intensity of someone who understood that this story was part of the ranch's legacy. "So the lesson is never give up?" he asked. "The lesson is know what's yours and be willing to defend it, but do it the right way. Through law, through evidence, through persistence, not through violence or revenge." What if Patricia had been reasonable from the start? Then we would have resolved it in a week instead of a year. We could have negotiated. Maybe I would have sold them the land or traded it for something else, but she made it a war, and wars have to be won. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. "When this ranch is mine someday, I'll remember that. I'll walk these boundaries every year just like you do." That's all I can ask. The Montana winter was harsh that year. Snow piled high and temperatures dropped below zero for weeks. I spent long nights by the fire, sometimes alone with Rex, sometimes with friends who stopped by. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, resting under its white blanket. During one of those quiet nights, I pulled out all my files from the dispute. Thousands of pages of documents, photos, surveys, legal briefs, everything. I had kept it all, organized and preserved. Part of me wanted to burn it, to let go of the past. But another part knew it was important to keep, both as a record and as a reminder. I created a summary document, a chronological account of everything that had happened with copies of key documents. I put it in a fireproof safe with instructions that it should be preserved with the ranch's historical records. Future generations should know what had happened here, what had been fought for and won. Spring came late but spectacular. The snow melted into rushing streams. The grass exploded in green growth. The cattle, shaggy with winter coats, moved eagerly to pasture. The cycle continued as it had for over a century, as it would for centuries more if we protected it properly. I walked the western boundary again that spring, as I did every year. Every marker was in place. Every fence was strong. The land stretched out exactly as it should, 40 feet further than the HOA had once claimed. Those 40 feet represented more than just land. They represented principle, justice, perseverance. Mark from the HOA joined me on that walk. It had become a tradition of sorts, both of us checking our respective sides of the boundary together. We chatted about mundane things, our families, the weather, local politics. The dispute was history now, a story we told but no longer lived. "You ever regret not settling earlier?" Mark asked. Before things got so bad, I considered that. No, because settling early would have meant accepting their version of the boundary, would have meant giving up what was mine. Sometimes you have to fight, even when fighting is hard. Patricia never understood that you couldn't be bullied. She never understood a lot of things. That's why she's where she is and I'm where I am. We reached the end of the boundary line, shook hands and parted ways. He headed back to his neighborhood of neat houses and manicured lawns. I headed back to my ranch of open pastures and working buildings. Both had their place. Both deserved respect. I thought about writing a book about the experience. Several people had suggested it, but every time I sat down to write, it felt wrong. The story was not really about me. It was about land, law, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Those themes were universal and timeless. Instead, I focused on living well and helping others. When ranchers contacted me about property disputes, I shared my experience freely. When law students wanted to interview me, I made time. When community groups wanted to discuss property rights, I attended and participated. The ranch became a teaching tool. School groups, legal seminars, agricultural conferences, all came to see the famous western boundary and hear the story. I never charged for these visits. Education was its own reward. Tom was eventually elected to the state legislature. One of his first acts was introducing a bill requiring more stringent verification procedures for property surveys near agricultural land. The bill passed and became known informally as the Quinn Law. I was honored but also bemused. I had never sought to be a lawmaker. "You made law through your case," Tom explained. "I just codified it." Years passed. Rex died peacefully in his sleep, and I mourned him deeply. A new border collie named Scout took his place. Miguel's son took over as ranch foreman when Sarah moved to her own place. The cycle continued. I slowed down, as older men do. Walking the entire property line took longer. Harder work was delegated to younger hands, but I never stopped checking those western boundary markers. That remained my responsibility. One day, about 10 years after the settlement, a woman approached me at a ranching conference. She was in her 30s, professional-looking, and she seemed nervous. "Mr. Quinn, I'm Jessica Morrison, Patricia Morrison's daughter." I studied her face, seeing echoes of Patricia in her features. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize for what my mother did. I was away at college when it all happened. By the time I understood what she had done, it was too late. She destroyed our family with her obsession. "Your mother made her choices," I said carefully. "You're not responsible for them, I know. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in my family supported her. My father and I tried to get her to stop, to settle reasonably. She wouldn't listen. We talked for an hour. Jessica told me about growing up with Patricia's need for control, how it had affected their entire family. She had become a mediator, helping people resolve disputes peacefully. Her mother's mistakes had shaped her career. "You ever talk to her?" I asked. "Occasionally. She's different now. Quieter. I think she finally understands what she lost, but she's too proud to apologize directly." "I don't need her apology," I said honestly. "I needed justice and I got it. The rest is between her and her conscience." Jessica thanked me for talking to her and left. I watched her go, thinking about how one person's actions rippled through so many lives. Patricia had hurt herself most of all. As I entered my mid-70s, I began serious succession planning. Benjamin Jr. had graduated and was working on the ranch full-time. He had good instincts and modern knowledge. The ranch would be in capable hands. I took him to every boundary marker, told him the story of each one. The western boundary got special attention. "These 40 feet," I said, standing on the disputed ground, "represent everything this ranch stands for. Not just property, but principle. Your great-great-grandfather homesteaded this land following the law. Every generation since has protected it following the law. That's your inheritance, Benjamin, not just the land itself, but the responsibility to preserve it properly." "I understand, Uncle Brad. And I promise I'll protect it." We shook hands there, on that special ground, sealing an unspoken covenant. The land would endure. The final chapter of the story came when Patricia Morrison died. I read her obituary in the newspaper. She was 68, had lived quietly in Wyoming and was survived by her daughter Jessica and her ex-husband. Services were private. I felt no satisfaction in her death. She had been a human being who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices. But I also felt no obligation to pretend she had been someone she was not. She had been my adversary, and the conflict between us had defined several years of both our lives. Jessica called me after the funeral. "She left you something," she said. "What?" "A letter. I'm mailing it to you." The letter arrived 3 days later. I opened it with Tom present, unsure what to expect. It was handwritten, shaky letters suggesting Patricia had written it not long before she died. It read, "Mr. Quinn, I owe you an apology I never had the courage to give in person. I was wrong. Not just about the boundary, but about how I handled it. I let pride and stubbornness turn a mistake into a disaster. You were defending your property, and I should have respected that. Instead, I attacked you and destroyed myself. I've had many years to think about what I did and who I was. I hope you can forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it. The land was always yours. I'm sorry I made you fight for it. Patricia Morrison." I read it twice, then handed it to Tom. "She finally got there," Tom said quietly. "Too late to matter," I replied. "But yes, she finally understood." I filed the letter with all the other documents from the case. It was the final piece of the story, the acknowledgement I had never expected to receive. That night, I stood on my porch one more time, Rex's old collar in my hand, looking at the mountains and the stars. 40 feet of land had sparked a war that taught an entire community about boundaries, respect, and justice. It had cost Patricia everything and had tested me to my limits. But in the end, the right had prevailed. The ranch was secure. The boundaries were clear. The next generation was ready. My work was done. As I turned to go inside, I took one last look at the western horizon, where somewhere in the darkness those boundary markers stood guard. They would be there long after I was gone, silent sentinels marking what one man had fought to preserve. And that, I thought, was legacy enough for any rancher.